I am Will Howell. I'm a faculty member at the Harris School of Public Policy, and I'm channeling the dean, Como Meritek, who is out of the country now. And I'm here to welcome you all. This is a really exciting lecture series that happens, and it's something that means a lot to the Harris School, the connections that the Harris School has with the Paulson Institute. Evan Feigenbaum is going to provide the first introduction, but Evan is the vice chairman at the Paulson Institute, and among his many accomplishments and affiliations, he, like today's speakers, has a connection with the Carnegie Endowment. And so, Evan, I'm going to hand it over to you and kick things off.
Okay, so this is, see a lot of familiar faces. So this is the, I guess this is the penultimate. This is the second to last one of these of this year. We've been doing them monthly. And we're delighted to have an old friend, Doug Paal, a man kind of old Washington hand, a lot of experience not just with China, but with a lot of places in Asia over many administrations. Here to talk a little bit, not just about China, but about the United States in Asia and U.S.-China relations. And we're lucky because we have the news hook of the President of the United States who just got back from Asia. So, as is the practice, a lot of people I've seen before, so I'm not going to say much about the Institute. I'll just say, as I've said before, we have lots of programs for students, and unlike the previous talks, summer is rapidly approaching because it's almost May. So, for those of you who are interested either in an internship or a student fellowship, or our doctoral students who are looking for fieldwork support in China, come see us, spend some time on the website. Apply. We have pre-doctoral fellowships, as I said, different kinds of internships for those interested in conservation work or in urban sustainability. These are internships in China or here in the United States. So it's a big part of our cooperation with the campus, but it's also a good opportunity, I think, for students who are looking to do things in China. Okay, with that, this is the latest in our series. Doug, you've been around the track a long time in Washington.
Yeah.
So Doug was the senior Asia guy in the White House under first President Bush, George H.W. Bush, as senior director for Asia on the National Security Council staff. But even before that, he had a distinguished career in the State Department and in other agencies, served out in Singapore and other places in Asia. He was the American representative in Taiwan in a technically unofficial, but actually official capacity in the second Bush administration, the first term of George W. Bush. But more importantly, is just, I think, one of the most experienced, oldest, wisest Asia hands around in the United States. And, we've tried to focus this series on different elements of contemporary China. We've done economics, we've done business, we've done media culture, we've done intellectual history. But I think we're going to broaden the lens a little bit today. So we're talking about the United States and China in Asia, but also a little bit taking the opportunity to use the hook of the president's trip to talk a little bit about where the United States finds itself, in particular because the narrative on the trip was focused so much on this notion of competition between the U.S. and China, strategic competition, economic competition, competition between economic vehicles like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, advocated by the United States, not including China, and others that are advocated by China that don't include China. We're going to take the opportunity to see if Doug can talk about the trip, but also maybe ground us a little bit in your sense of where things are in Asia, where the United States and China find themselves in Asia, and what developments in the region strategically and economically mean for them and for their relationship. So with that, we'll have you talk for 35, 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. So please join me in welcoming Doug Paal.
I'll do that here.
However you want to do it.
Okay, thanks. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon, this past noon. I wish I were here for your next session when Evan Osnos is speaking, because he's terrific, and we never see him in Washington. He's always out in places like this. And for this presentation today, I didn't come with a big boffo beginning. Most Asians, when they give talks, start with an apology, and most Americans start with a joke, so I'll apologize for not having a joke and ask you to chuckle a little bit. What I'd like to do is, I mean, I don't know how closely, you must have followed this president's trip somewhat or you wouldn't be interested in sitting here today. But I always feel that the media just doesn't do the justice to what's really happening. It's always some meme that's in the reporter's head or like a flock of turkeys, all the White House press room all focus on the same things at the same time. And this trip became, it was originally scheduled for last fall. Obama was to have attended the APEC leaders meeting and then have gone on to a couple of other capitals where he'd previously missed previously scheduled visits. And then last November, the Republicans shut down the Congress. And the president didn't think he could go when the Congress was shut down. And so this is a makeup trip. And I can tell you, having done makeup trips in diplomacy, makeup diplomacy and makeup sex are completely different. You're never going to have a really happy makeup trip in the diplomatic world. And what happened between November and this trip in April was very consequential, and that is we had the Russian pressure on Ukraine, the administration's witness of Crimea being pulled away from Ukraine and taken by Russia without much ability to stop it. And like last year's decision by Obama, after ups and downs about whether to blow up Syria for using chemical weapons, one Friday night he took a walk with Dennis McDonough on the White House lawn and changed the policy from one, I am determined to go and punish Syria for using chemical weapons, to I'm going to ask the Congress to think about punishing Syria. And he then got lucky, and Kerry and Lavrov struck a deal, and in fact the Syrian chemical weapon problem seems to be getting resolved. So Obama thinks it all worked out fine. But it's kind of like dog whistles. I mean, all throughout Asia, among the allies and friends, they didn't pay attention to this, what happened afterwards. They paid attention to the fact that the American president, when confronted with a decision about national security, was going to give the decision to the American Congress, one of the most obviously dysfunctional bodies on the face of the earth. And so that set a lot of nervousness through the system. And then, so the trip migrated from being partly a makeup trip last November and doing some economic business for the United States with our friends and allies in the region to proving that you're not as weak as we thought you looked last time. Give us some reassurance. And of course, this is all against a background of China, which is still recording pretty good rates of growth and very strong defense spending. The Chinese defense budget this year is scheduled to go up 12.2%, even though the economy is only scheduled to go 7.5%. And people out in the region are always looking for reassurance. So the trip took on the theme of reassuring the allies and friends against what have been Chinese pressures. And then, so you work your way down the itinerary. President Obama was going to go originally to Japan, Malaysia, Philippines, and then come back. He had previously scheduled to visit Malaysia twice and canceled. And then he felt the Philippines had to be added. One, because the Philippines is doing surprisingly well under its new administration, under President Noynoy Aquino, but also because we had this huge disaster in the southern Philippines where the U.S. played a critical role in providing very effective humanitarian assistance, and he wanted to take some credit for that and reify our relationship with the Philippines and hopefully reach an agreement on reintroduction of transient American forces into the Philippines after a 20-year hiatus, where we've been unable to do that in any numbers. It was hard to put a theme to the trip, and so the reporters all injected this, we're going to put a fist in the face of China. He's going to show that he's not as weak as he was in Syria, not as weak as he was in Ukraine, and really raise a fist to the Chinese with our friends and allies in the region. The Chinese were expecting that. I was in Shanghai a couple weeks ago, and I heard from very serious people saying, yeah, we think you're going to come and really stir the pot. And a lot of the administration's second-level policy people, the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the National Security Council's Senior Director for Asia, had made statements to the media or to Congress that suggested the U.S. was toughening up its position and was really going to get into China's face. And so it was natural that people focused on that. Another part of it is, and this got characterized as Obama rebalancing the rebalancing, or making the pivot work. Now, I'm going to introduce you to my concept of how we have this thing called the pivot or the rebalance. First, despite the fact the New York Times in its archives says that pivot came first and rebalance came second, I can tell you that rebalance came first and pivot came second. The administration spent about a year talking to people like me around Washington, trying to sell us on the notion of rebalancing to Asia. And the idea, as formally presented, is we had been unbalanced in our disposition of our forces and treasure in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that the real growth and focus of security concern going forward, decades ahead, is going to be Asia. And so we should put this back into proper balance. I can find no fault with that logic. Mr. Bush and Condi Rice had missed a few meetings in East Asia. They had declined to join the East Asian Summit. So there were some things that could have been done more under the Bush administration, but they were preoccupied with counterterrorism and other things. And Hank here did all the work on China and actually left the U.S.-China policy in very good shape. Such good shape that when the Obama administration came in and said, we don't want to change it. They left it in good shape. Let's keep it that way. But they wanted to get across a political point that they were new and different and doing something big. And what it turned out to be was an extension of a longer political argument that might be familiar to folks who follow politics in Chicago, which is that Obama, when he was running for the nomination to be president in 2008, had a personal record of really being opposed to the war in Iraq. And he knew that Hillary Clinton, his rival, was for a surge in Iraq. And so he said, okay, we're going to get out of Iraq. But I don't, quietly saying to themselves, we don't want to have to run against the Republicans by being cut and run Democrats again. We need to have a robust side to this. So we're going to get tough in Afghanistan. We're going to fight the real war in Afghanistan. So that was political cover for what they were doing to win the primary, had the primaries in the Democratic campaign for presidential candidacy. Fast forward to 2012, as we're getting closer to 2012, the the Democrats in the White House were pretty clear that they were going to face Romney. It might have been somebody else, but they thought it was going to be Romney. And he would take a kind of knee-jerk approach on China because he's been doing that for a long time. And that they needed to look tough toward the Republicans to give the voters a view that this was not a weak administration cutting and running from Afghanistan and Iraq and now Asia. So they came up with the rebalance, and what they talked to people like me was about this shifting of our resources and attention to where the world's growing. But when they talked to political reporters, they said, we're going to rebalance or pivot, as Mrs. Clinton later termed it, to Asia, because that's going to give us the opportunity to really show China. We're not going to be patsies for these Chinese and the kind of tough measures they're using on Japan and other of our friends and allies in the region. So you had two themes coming out. One sort of you sell to the polite people, and one you sell to the political people. And eventually the political theme dominated. By the time of the election itself, most writing about Asia was about how the pivot was designed to go after China and to really show the Chinese were being tough. And a lot of our neighbors and friends in the region started to believe it, especially the Japanese. The Japanese were very eager. You know, Japan runs a very meager defense establishment in terms of budget and size. They're really high quality, but they're very small relative to the size of Japan. Their budget has been below 1% of GDP for the defense side. Much of that goes to American forces to be in Japan. And they've got very, very modest procurement, modest deployment schedules. And of course, they have the peace constitution and no out-of-area operations for their military. So the Japanese are always looking for a way to leverage American power to their purposes without having themselves dig deeper in their pockets. Remember, Japan has had relatively slow growth for 20 years. This pattern of not spending on defense well predates that, but it's made it harder for them to reconsider spending on defense. And so they've been eager to get the US hooked into their controversy over the disputed island territories, the Diaoyu Islands or the Senkaku Islands. I'm not going to go into detail on that because that has its own midrash of explanation. If somebody has a question, we can talk about it later. But the Japanese and the Chinese have been going at it diplomatically for some time. China has struck a posture where it's just not going to talk to Mr. Abe, the new prime minister. Abe has been doing the things in the alliance that the United States has wished that Japan would do for some time, addressing our controversial Marine Air Base in Okinawa that needs to be moved out of a dense urban area into something where planes can operate more safely. There's been an internal Japanese fight over that and hasn't been moved for decades. We also wanted them to spend a little more on radars, on ABM type equipment, the stuff like Aegis and Patriot missiles, and they're doing that now under Mr. Abe. I could go down a long list of F-35 acquisitions and changes in behavior, such as passing a new rule within the Japanese government to allow their forces to assist us if we are in Asia and someone attacks us. Our mutual defense treaty only has us defending them, and they're going to now commit to doing a little something for us if it's necessary. So these are all happy things. The other side of it is Mr. Abe comes from a very long-lived political family, and his grandfather was at one time indicted as a war criminal. And like a lot of Japanese families whose ancestors were in the wartime cabinet of World War II, they'd like to rectify the record. They want to make things look a little better about their ancestors. And they feel that history has dealt them a harsher judgment than they deserve. And it's hard for a lot of us to understand this, but I go to Japan a lot, have done for many, many years. And you have to realize there are families that get together every Sunday, multi-generations, and they fume over this stuff over the dinner table. And it really lives for them, whereas everybody else thinks, history's moved on, stop bringing up these wartime things. Right now we got a prime minister who exemplifies that. Mr. Abe's grandfather was a wartime defense minister. He was a man in charge of munitions. He was the man who oversaw Manchuria when China was occupied by Japan. So for the Chinese, they look at this guy and they say, here's a pure expression of what is worst about the history of Japan. And he's saying, oh, forget about it, boys will be boys, and times are different now. And it doesn't sit well. And so there's a real antipathy. And moreover, China has traditionally dealt with Japan in a very personalistic fashion. Japan has big LDP, mostly as in charge of the country most of the time. But within that, there are factions, and the Chinese exquisitely understand who leans toward China, who leans against China among those factions. And they've got their friends, Mr. Fukuda, who's a very fine former prime minister, recently at Paal, maybe you saw him there. And then you've got Abe, who is sort of the devil incarnate in China's eyes. So Chinese-Japanese diplomacy is absolutely frozen right now at every level. You talk to a Chinese official like Wang Yi, the foreign minister, who speaks beautiful Japanese, who's lived many years in Japan, was ambassador there for 3 years. And he immediately foams at the mouth about these militarists, they're going to take Japan down. The polls in Japan show 70% of the people want nothing to do with war or defense. And yet, these are militarists, they're going to go back on the path of war. So we got a big disconnect. And so Obama flew into Tokyo having to deal with tremendous pressures from the Chinese not to do anything for the Japanese because it'll only feed their militarism. And tremendous pressure from the US and within our own system to say this alliance with Japan is meaningful. And we have to draw a red line against Chinese military action against Japan, or we'll invite Chinese military action against Japan. Much as when, in 1950, then Defense Secretary of State did not draw a security line through the Korea Peninsula and say we would protect it. He drew it around the Korean Peninsula, and then 6 months later we had an invasion of South Korea by North Korea. This is very much a live memory in Washington among defense people, so we had to draw a red line, say the U.S. treaty, mutual defense treaty with Japan must embrace those islands administered by Japan, including the Senkaku Diaoyudao Islands. And the Chinese wanted us desperately not to say that, to say there's a dispute, Japan should settle with China and negotiate this away. Obama got to Japan and he did a pretty effective straddle. He said on the one hand the treaty applies, it's a good treaty, don't mistake it for weakness. On the other hand, he said to the Japanese, disputes need to be handled well, which is something because the Japanese don't admit there is a dispute. And that these disputes should be dealt with, and tensions with China should be dealt with in a rational, military and in a way that does not unilaterally attempt to alter the status quo. And that was the big lift in Japan for Obama. The second thing that was in the media got a lot more attention in the media than was not really part of the trip. There's a component of the rebalance to Asia is economic. There's diplomacy. You pick up the level of diplomacy, and the Obama people faulted Bush for missing meetings. And then Obama became president, and he and his people started to miss meetings. And they also said there has to be an economic. If we're going to put all the security investment in Asia, the American taxpayer should see a return in the economics of the situation. And one of the things that needs to be done is to expand the trading area in the region. And there's a term for this called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is an effort to expand free trade beyond border measures deep into economies, to open up service trade. The U.S. is a great service provider. It should be pretty advantageous to us to open up the closed service markets in the region, to reduce the role of state-owned enterprises. And this is a great free trade notion that takes us to what trade negotiators consistently say are 21st standards, high quality. They never tell you what that means, but they say these high standards. But I think a fair analysis would say this TPP offers us real opportunity. In fact, TPP had been accepted by the George Bush administration, but the Obama administration came in and sat on it for 2 years because Democratic constituencies are divided on trade, and they didn't move on that, or the Colombian Free Trade Agreement, or the Panama, or the Korean Free Trade Agreement for a couple of years until they got closer to the re-elect and they thought it might be useful. So now the TPP has been brought in as the economic part, and the security part, and the diplomatic part of the rebalance to Asia, or the pivot to Asia. And a lot of people have been hoping that Obama would use this trip to Japan to finally break through some of the long, well-known barriers to American market penetration of the Japanese services, trades, agriculture in particular, to get some American cars sold into the Japanese roads. These have been big dreams of important constituencies in the American Congress for years. And Japan has always been held up as an example of a recalcitrant trade partner that takes but doesn't give. And so people decided this was, somehow they got it in their heads, and the reporters got it into their heads, that this was going to be the moment when we got a breakthrough, a big change in the situation. But what they hadn't done is sort of think back a few steps. The administration, in order to negotiate on stuff that really matters with other countries and things that are politically sensitive, you've got to be able to offer your bottom line and exchange it for their bottom line. And you don't do that until you know it's the bottom line. And in America, going back to the Syrian question, in America, if Congress gets its hands on a trade agreement and is allowed to renegotiate it, all 535 members of Congress, but certainly the 100 senators who would have to vote, will have some way of trying to renegotiate every aspect of the agreement. So you have to have what's called technically trade promotion authority, a legislative vehicle that says to the president, you bring us a trade package after you've negotiated the bottom line with your partners, and we'll pass it up or down. We're not going to take it apart and renegotiate it. Then you can get a negotiation going. President Obama has chosen not to do that. He's chosen not to go for trade promotion authority, but to keep the trade negotiations going. So they've been having meeting after meeting after meeting, and they never get to the bottom line because no one's going to get to the bottom line until they see we have trade promotion authority. And the hang up here is that trade promotion authority would require the president to go to his members on this Democratic side. They'll get a good Republican vote, but they always need a few more votes on the Democratic side. He's got to ask them to vote for trade promotion authority. Right now, there's nationwide, and in Congress in particular, there's a lot of hostility to free trade agreements. There's a lot of feeling that NAFTA didn't work out well for us, even though it actually did. Some people lost jobs here, but other sectors did really well out of NAFTA. But there's a lot of feeling in Congress that they don't want to touch this, it's going to cost jobs. And the president's got a re-election coming up for his in midterm this November. The outlook for the Democratic majority in the Senate is the worst it's been for the time Obama's been in office. And the numbers don't look good now. That can change, but they don't look good now. So he's chosen not to go for trade promotion authority, not to upset the constituencies he needs in those elections, labor union organizers, environmentalists, others who have their different views about these trade agreements. So the U.S. has joined a negotiation which has 11 partners, and they're all negotiating every week. There's something new done, but they're not going to get there anytime soon. So the expectations that you may have seen in the press about Obama going to get agreement, or the description in the New York Times of a failure to get an agreement, were just off the chart. It was never going to happen, and nor in the other capitals he visited. In January, February, Obama was planning not to go to Korea, but to go to Malaysia and the Philippines. I came back from Korea about that time, and the same militarism, the same history issues that had riled up the Chinese have inflamed the Korean population. Korea was occupied almost 50 years by Japan. It was a very harsh occupation. The army ran the country, and it ran it very badly. And there's still tremendous anti-Japanese Korean sentiment. And Abe has stirred that up by appointing people to the National Broadcasting Company's board who are, unreconstructed revisionists who want to take back that word rape of Nanking, or that anything bad ever happened. He's allowed his ministers to go up to Aomori Prefecture and look out at Takeshima Island, which is occupied and disputed by Japan, occupied by South Korea. That has in recent times become a subject of Korean patriotism, and this has gotten the heat up between the two populations. The two leaders didn't want to meet with each other. They've basically stopped functioning, except the defense elements of Japan and Korea will cooperate occasionally when the US is present, but not bilaterally. Just before going to Japan and Korea, Obama arranged for Abe and Park Geun-hye, the president of South Korea, to meet in The Hague for the first time since the two of them have taken office. It was a very bad, you could see on television, you could see the bad body language, very bad chemistry between the two, but nonetheless they met. And this was an attempt by Obama to help push these two together. And I came along with some other guys and we said, you really got to go to Korea. You can't go to Japan with the way the Korean people are looking at Japan today and then not go to Korea. It'll be seen as uneven treatment, slighting Korea, even though Obama previously had been 3 times to Korea. And that argument carried the day, and so they added Korea. And that ended up being a fairly good stop because he was able to talk in the present tense about the current threat coming from this madman in North Korea, Kim Jong-un, who right now is building 2 deep holes for what they announced yesterday, again, would be a new type of nuclear weapons test. We don't know what that means, but we have some ideas. But anyway, he's getting ready to test, and we've got provocations coming from the north. The U.S. has been investing in deployments of B-2s and B-52s and F-22s and other things to try to let the North know this is no time to be playing games with the South's security. But the tensions have been rising. So Obama coming in and then reaffirming the alliance, reaffirming strong U.S.-Korean cooperation, going together with President Park to the Combined Forces Command headquarters, I think sent a good message. And at the same time, he found a way of talking about history issues, comfort women, and the other things that really rankle in South Korea, that showed empathy with where the Koreans fit on this. There was a little bit of trade negotiation because we're not happy. When we did our U.S.-Korean free trade agreement, our negotiators arranged for American cars to be more readily accessible in the Korean market, and it turned out Toyota's cars made in American factories are doing great, but not Ford, not others in the Korean market. So they're trying to get that tweaked, that in this TPP negotiations. Obama then went to Malaysia. No president has been to Malaysia since 1966. Lyndon Johnson was there in '66. At that time, Malaysia was an example of a country that had fought a communist insurgency successfully. And so it made sense in the middle of fighting the Vietnam War to stop there. And I said 66. It has to be 66 is right. Time flies. But in the interim years, Malaysia had been governed by a coalition driven by UMNO, the United Malays Nationalities Organization, and a coalition that they had. And the leadership of that had become Mahathir Mohamad, who for almost 20 years in office as prime minister would sometimes do things with us economically or in security areas that were helpful, but in public would never say a kind word, and would often blame the US for everything that went wrong. For example, the 1997 financial crisis. Against all evidence to the contrary, he blamed George Soros and said it was American money games that had caused the great distress that swept through Southeast Asia. And there are other people he could have pointed to, but he chose to do it that way. And we had these constant difficult relations with Mahathir. Since this new Prime Minister Najib has come in, things have gotten a lot smoother. Some things are not new that they're doing, and some things are. Early in the Obama administration, because I'm an old friend of the Prime Minister, I was asked to go see him because he expressed an interest in visiting the White House and having an Oval Office picture before he gets up for his re-election. And so I went with a list of 7 items that the US would really hope he could work on if he wanted to improve the atmosphere for that kind of a meeting. And within 6 months, he did all 7 of them. They were all breakthroughs. So this is a government that needed to be rewarded and had been promised a visit twice, and then both times been postponed, once by the oil spill in the Caribbean from BP's oil well, and secondly by last year's government shutdown. So it was a very important thing to give some face and to reward the kind of behavior we're getting from Malaysia that we'd like to see from Malaysia, and not to punish them for having done that. And I think they got through that trip pretty well. The one controversial item on it was whether or not to see the frequently jailed and maligned former Deputy Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, who has been most recently resentenced for homosexual rape, a charge that no one really believes, but it's taken him out of the running for an office in the next round of elections in Malaysia, so it was seen as a nakedly political ploy. I'm an old friend of Anwar as well, and I was very pleased that Obama, he didn't make the point of personally seeing Anwar, but he did have National Security Advisor Susan Rice meet with Anwar and the leaders of the Indian and the Chinese ethnic dissident communities in Malaysia. So I think the messages were sent, good cooperation from the government, reward them for that. A reminder that we're watching their politics. We hope they can do things a little better. Then finally, he went to the Philippines, and here in just a day or two before Obama arrived in the Philippines, the United States and the Philippines signed the Advanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. We used to have a very strong alliance relationship that was cemented by every 5 years a new bases agreement in the Philippines, which gave us access from 1898 to 1992 to what is Clark Air Base. Earlier it was a cavalry base before it was an air base, we're counting back to 1898. And then Subic Naval Base, which is the biggest naval facility in the world that we had been using, and was a major staging ground during the Vietnam War, for example, and then later in other circumstances. That when Marcos fell from power, the politics in Philippines changed, and Marcos and the United States were identified in the popular mind as the oppressors of the ordinary Filipino people. And so when the question of renewing the base agreement in the Philippines came up after Marcos stepped down and President Cory Aquino, mother of the current president. By the way, there's a theme here. Abe was the grandson of a prime minister and a foreign minister's son. Park Geun-hye, the president of Korea, is the daughter of the former dictator of Korea, Park Chung-hee. Najib, the prime minister visited in Malaysia, is the son of the founding prime minister of Malaysia. And Aquino, he visited in Philippines, is the son of the previous president of the Philippines. You'll get more used to this when it's Bush or Clinton next time. Under Mrs. Aquino in 1991-92, the Philippine Senate finally decided to reject a base agreement with the US. And we were pushed out. Very interesting timing, because the very next year, or no, 2 years later, 1994, China seized a Philippine-claimed territory offshore called Mischief Reef. And the Filipinos could do nothing about it, and they had no security arrangements with us as they had before. And as has often been the case with China, China looks for orphans and grabs them. In 1974, the US had announced its withdrawal over time from Vietnam. We were not going to put more assets in. China then seized the Paracel Islands from South Vietnam, and we were not going to plus up to go save those little islands for Vietnam. In 1988, North Vietnam, or Vietnam as a whole, had a relationship with the Soviet Union. The Soviets were in Cam Ranh Bay. They had a big fleet there. The Chinese told Gorbachev that if you want to have a good relationship with China, you got to get rid of that relationship with Vietnam, the defense relationship. So literally, as the Russian fleet, the then Soviet fleet, was steaming out of Cam Ranh Bay and going north, they passed by the Chinese seizing the Spratly Islands from Vietnam. And whenever these countries get orphaned, they tend to, they don't have an outside big backer, there tends to be trouble. And this has happened to the Philippines. Now, after 20 years of internal consideration and modest efforts by the US to get back involved, they did sign the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. This will not lead to us having bases at Clark or Subic again, but it will be access. And it'll give us chances to go in and help the Philippines upgrade some of their defense facilities. Philippines is really behind, in no position to face off against a real well-armed China. They have a lot more work that needs to be done. And the president got to do some high fives over the successful rescue of so many thousands of Filipinos who were distressed by the typhoon that hit them last year. So those are the 4 stops along the way. I think that the judgment coming away is that the president struck a good tone through all of these. The tone of, we're here to help you deal with your problems. In fact, what he almost did was deny the pivot or the rebalance, because there was no talk of a pivot or rebalance back in 1992 when we were trying to hold on to our bases in the Philippines. We were trying to stay there because America provided stability. And in the end, the president ended up saying, yes, we're coming back and doing nothing differently than we've been doing for the last 25 or 30 years. And so he sort of kind of undercut the theme of my administration's rebalance. But that's all right. I mean, that's a good outcome. The Philippines is now more stable. Malaysia is moving in a good direction. Look across Southeast Asia. Burma is in a much better place than it was a few years ago. Japan has got real tense relations with China, but they've got a stronger security position. And Korea is quite, even though the Koreans and Japanese are not cooperating in ways we'd like to see them do, it's a little better than it was before the trip. So I think you can point to this as having been worth doing all in all, but not, you know, a 4-run home run by the batter, because that was not in the cards for this time around. So that's a 40-minute introduction, a little less, to the issues, and I'm sure you've got thoughts or questions you might like to raise. So I'll open the floor, sir.
Yeah, I noticed that of all the countries that you consider, there's no consideration for Vietnam or Indonesia, who are also, Vietnam being a growing manufacturing power, Indonesia being a large country. I was wondering if there's some reason for that.
Well, he asked about why no Indonesia or Vietnam. The answer is Indonesia, the president's been to twice. He lived there as a kid for a few years. These trips are always going to be less than the sum total of our relationships, because you only have 1 week of presidential time, and you have to hit the spots that need hitting. He'd been twice to Indonesia and had postponed it twice as well. So it's always a makeup trip, never quite the real thing. And Indonesia is in an election year right now. They're going to have an election on July 7. It's be a terrible time for a president to show up and mess up their internal politicking. Vietnam, we're not quite ready for a state visit. We've had very high-level visits. Secretary of Defense Panetta went there a year and a half ago, and I thought he made a slightly too belligerent set of statements while he was there, but on the whole, the symbolic nature of his trip was helpful. Vietnam, unlike the Philippines and some of the others in Southeast Asia, Vietnam is strategically extremely sharp. They know how to play China. They've been playing China for hundreds of years. They sometimes take a lot of casualties. Sometimes they make some big successes. They go back and forth. Right now, they're handling China pretty well. They are tough with China on some issues, and they find ways to accommodate that meet their mutual interests on others. So there's really no urgency to getting into Vietnam. In the back?
Apart from the symbolism of Obama's going to Japan first and spending more time there, did he do anything? Did he give anything concrete to the Japanese? And does he have the same kind of leverage over Abe that Eisenhower say had over his grandfather Kishi? I mean, that kind of power relationship that could get Kishi to do our bidding for us there.
They really, really wanted an affirmation of the defense agreement for the islands. If they had not gotten that, it would have been, I mean, the Fox News would have gone through the roof. They would have had such a great day saying that Obama was, uniformly weak around the world. And so it was important for him to be tough, and so he didn't. It wasn't a big cost for the administration to say tough things. And it's been the standard position of repeated administrations that we would defend the territories administered by Japan, just as it says in the Mutual Defense Treaty. That was the big ask. They wanted the face of the visit. They wanted to have the fact that Abe defied our expressed, privately delivered messages not to go to Yasukuni Shrine, where there are 17 convicted Class A war criminals enshrined in Tokyo, not to go and honor them. He nevertheless did that in just days after Vice President Biden asked him not to do that. And so there was some concern that we would express that kind of pique. So it was kind of a negative gift in that sense, not to go and make them more embarrassed over that, on condition that they would then work to improve relations with Korea, because it's the alliance structure we want to see working, because that's important for our strategic goals in the region more broadly. There was a lot of negotiating, economic negotiating, but it was never going to reach the final stage because, as I said earlier, without trade promotion authority from Congress, it's an abstraction, not a reality that you're dealing with. Sir?
One could question whether a pivot makes sense or is possible in the sense that there's an interconnectedness of the world. There's the credibility question, which would be universal and symbolic, but also one could look at, in the long run, economic developments. For example, analogous to the way the United States brokered an economic community in Europe that ended centuries of war between Germany and France, one could imagine an economic community that would bring Pakistan and India and add Afghanistan and other stands into an economic community, which would have great import for Chinese trade. That there's already a lot of interest in developing railroads and pipelines. But for such a community to develop, that arguably would require continued American influence in Afghanistan and the Middle East. So withdrawal from that area by the United States that has an opportunity cost of not providing a security frame for such an economic community would have a big impact. And kind of conversely, if such economic ties developed more at the initiative of a kind of mercantilist view, it would be a community of a very different character. Mm-hmm. So I wonder, like, looking both at the symbolic but also concrete trade relation aspects linking China to the rest of the world, is a pivot a sane strategic conception.
Well, you've covered a lot. Let me just touch on like the Hawaiian muumuu, touch on 2 or 3 points. The pivot was a lousy term. The guy who wrote pivot into the text of the article being prepared to be put out over Mrs. Clinton's name said he did it tired after a trip coming home at 11:30 at night, and he thought rebalance was too many syllables, pivot was better, more sporty, and so they did pivot. And then what happened was that people said, oh, you're pivoting from the Middle East or from Europe to Asia. And the rebalance is a better terminology because we were unbalanced in Afghanistan and Iraq. We were spending a lot of blood and treasure. We needed to return some of the troops who'd been infilled to those places back to where they had been originally stationed in Asia, providing the stability that's brought Asia prosperity for 70 years. And that was the argument. But the pivot got people thinking, well, they're leaving here and they're going there and they're not paying attention, and Mr. Putin thinks he's got a free field of fire now that he can go into. in his near abroad because the U.S. is distracted by Asia. So sometimes language gets ahead of you and it doesn't help. And I can see where it's obviously affected your own perception. On the question of whether or not we can return Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India to what were the ideal economic circumstances of the 14th century, when you could buy a peach from Samarkand in the streets of Delhi, still fresh. You can't do that today, or you only do it in specialized markets that fly things in back and forth, because the markets have all gone from the traditional land-driven routes to maritime routes through technology, and because of the politics of these countries, gone very badly. I can't imagine the U.S. wanting to get too much involved back in Afghanistan, economically or politically or militarily. And you can't do political or economic unless you've got security. So there's a necessary military element. Today, Pew pollsters just put out another report on American attitudes towards spending time, energy, and human life on foreign hotspots. And the public mood is still swinging away from doing that. Obama's been reading that, I think, quite accurately. The question is, it's one thing to read the polls accurately, it's another thing to be president of the United States. And you have to know what things must be done, even if the polls don't like them. And that's a test he's yet to face. Or maybe we'll know at some future date that he missed the test some time back. I don't see the U.S. getting involved in ways that would be helpful. The good news, to answer your question, is now that the U.S. has signaled that we really are departing, the locals are starting to get more invested into the issue. The bad news about that is India's taking care of its northern friends in Afghanistan, Pakistan's feeding the Taliban in the south. But the good news is that China is trying to get in there with investments and is taking a more serious look at how to stabilize Afghanistan, with a view to keeping Afghanistan's Muslim extremism from infecting China's far west. It's very driven by a very short-term but real security concern. So the outlook isn't great for that part of the world. We had a couple of good prime ministers, a president and prime minister in India and Pakistan a few years back, where they started to make progress on the economic side. But these other prickly issues overwhelm them, and they're going in very different directions today. Sir? Oh, there's a microphone. That makes it easier.
Thank you very much for being today with us for the very informative lecture. You touched a little bit on that, on what happened in Ukraine. And in Russia recently there has been a lot of talk about that, well, if the West doesn't want us, we could reorient towards Asia more. And do you think it has any implications on the strategic balance in Asia, or is more of an empty talk? And how do you view this?
I don't think it's empty talk. There's a strategic potential, but I don't think the strategic potential can be realized easily or early. But I think we're going to see, on specific issues, we're going to see changes. China will be less obliged to follow our lists of desired outcomes if they can hide behind Russian opposition based on Russian concerns over a lot of things the West is doing. An example came up just last week when I was in Korea with a Russian visitor there, that he was asked, will Russia join in increased financial sanctions on North Korea if North Korea sets off 2 more nuclear weapons? And the answer was, not while the US is putting sanctions on Russia. That would be a consequence. Was that strategically meaningful? Well, over time it may tell. I expect that China and Russia are finally going to achieve an energy deal that's been waiting. The argument has been the Chinese want too low a price for the gas, the Russians want too high a price. They can get to the price point. They've got a good reason to get to that price point now. And I expect China will end up being the stronger, having the more leverage in that deal. And it might be not just Chinese cash for Russian gas, it may be Chinese investment for that. Putin will be in Shanghai for a summit, the acronym for which I can never remember. It's 13 countries that are not the usual summits that everybody else goes to. He's going to be in Shanghai for that in May, and that will be an opportunity to close deals and to reach perhaps different forms of consensus on how to deal with Iran, which is, we're coming up to the deadline on the Iranian agreement in June, and then how to deal with Syria, and other issues as they come up that involve UN Security Council permanent members. And Russia and China have frequently hidden behind each other in the past. They have more reason to do that now when there's something they don't want to do on the table. Putin will also go to Japan on this trip in May. And the Japanese have, Abe himself has been very much behind initiatives to find new ways to work with the Russians. His goal is to get back the disputed northern territories north of Hokkaido. And one of my colleagues in our office in Moscow published a report a year ago saying Japan should provide investment in Vladivostok, and Russia can then turn the islands back over to Japan in a swap deal. And there's a lot of interest in both Japan and Moscow that I'm hearing about concerning this. From Russia's point of view, you know, being a very resource-rich but population-poor country in the Far East, and China being population-rich and resource-poor, it's an awkward relationship. And the Russians would like to tilt the balance back in their favor by getting more people and more development in the Russian Far East. But as to the long-term strategic consequences, I'm always mindful of the fact that you've got, between Russia and China, a river border of 2,700 kilometers. And do you know how many bridges there are across that river? 0. So it's not a naturally connected pair of countries, and a lot of hostility and suspicion lies behind it. So I would say tactical opportunities, yes. Strategic, it's too early to say. In the corner there.
Yeah, so in the past few months, there's been a bit of media coverage on this, including some publications from this team. But what do you see the U.S.'s role being in future China and Taiwan relations?
Okay. The future of U.S. role in China-Taiwan relations. Well, we're going to find out real soon. Taiwan's current incumbent government, which has made the U.S. extremely comfortable over the last 6+ years by reducing tensions with China and vastly expanding connections to China, in contrast with the previous 8 years, including when I was in Taiwan as the U.S. representative. The president of Taiwan was constantly trying to stick a thorn into China's side on one issue or another, trying to get China to be, to keep the issues, the friction high to use for domestic political purposes in Taiwan. And so Ma Ying-jeou's government of the last 6.5 years has lulled us into thinking this can just go on forever. But behind the scenes, he's not been doing very well in the polls. And his party is very divided. And the next election is 2016. And the people who are running for office from the opposition party, whose chances are improving, have no policy for the mainland. And they will not articulate one. So we could enter another one of these periods. I don't think it'll be as friction-filled as the 8 years of Chen Shui-bian from 2000, 2008. But it could be much more friction-filled than the last 6.5 years. So we will be pushed back into this dispute, whether we like it or not. The economic integration that's taken place between China and Taiwan is pretty thorough. Taiwan has never played its hand as well as it could. The real opportunity was back in the 1990s, when they were distinctly more advanced than the Chinese economy. And China was in the world's doghouse for having Tiananmen on its hands. And so that would have been a good time to strike a deal. But the Taiwanese didn't show an interest in a deal, and that time has passed. And the leverage is completely reversed. China's the stronger party. And Taiwan is almost a supplicant. It's not literally, but almost a supplicant when it comes to their relative strengths, economic and military. So the U.S. will become increasingly important to Taiwan so long as the population on Taiwan does not want to get closer to China. They don't have the wherewithal to keep China at bay. They will need the American implicit security agreement to do that. That will involve decisions by the U.S. president on arms sales, on providing military services and training, things like that to the island going down. And every year that passes, China is less tolerant to that sort of thing. And that in turn imposes on the administration to run a comprehensive China policy so that whatever happens as a result of these historical circumstances that have us somewhat at odds over Taiwan, the broader relationship is strong enough that we don't go down a path that's driven by what happens on Taiwan. And that's the art of leadership and governance that is, you as voters should ask from whoever is seeking your vote as president. Yes, sir.
Thank you for coming. I think among your general insights, I kind of lost sight of your prescription for the Obama trip. Would you mind restating like how you saw what President Obama's trip meant and like what you think he should have done differently?
Well, again, it was a make-up trip. He was trying to make up for having failed to get out to these countries, and in the process, Ukraine had risen, and so it became important for him to show a strong security hand in the region. And so he visited 2 countries that are having active disputes with China over their territorial, I mean, they're very small territories, but they're really hot emotional disputes over these territories with some military overtones. And he wanted to project the stability that comes from the American presence. Some reporters were asking me about this, and they said, you know, I mean, how does he create stability? You know, is this enough to be stable? I said, no, you have to think in terms of the alternative. What if he went there and said, well, we are now beginning the dismantlement of our arrangement with the Philippines and the dismantlement of our arrangement with Japan? Well, if you want a formula for instability, that would be it. Going out and sometimes repeating yourself about maintaining our capacity to defend our allies and friends and their capacity to take care of this is part of maintaining the stability that has allowed most of Asia to develop their economies first and their militaries third or fourth over the last 70 years. You know, the law of the jungle has been kept at bay by the American security presence. Even if you think of that security presence as an artifact of World War II and maybe awkward to the times when everything is transmitted by email in an instant, there's still a fundamental stability that provides. And so countries like Singapore and Thailand and Malaysia and Indonesia, they all have issues with each other. And if the US weren't there providing a kind of buffer, they'd all be at each other's throats, they'd be arming to the teeth, generations of their kids would be drafted, and they wouldn't be going off to work in the factories that are shipping us all these great textiles and electronics and other things, and making their own countries much better off and getting higher standards of living. So the American security structure has had a tremendously beneficial effect in preventing the arrival of the law of the jungle. It's like oxygen. You don't. Joe Nye at Harvard famously said, you know, security is like oxygen. You don't notice it until it's gone. And I'm not at all defensive about saying America's doing the right thing and we got to keep doing the right thing in that part of the world. We have to prove to our people sometimes that it's worth doing, show that there are economic benefits for us as well as for our partners. And that's what the trade negotiators' job is, and the president in guiding those trade negotiators to help them do that. And the American business community. Does that get to your point? Or?
Yeah,
The security is a big part of it. The other part is, you know, you want behavior from states that improves the general condition of the region and improves our ability to operate. Under Prime Minister Najib in Malaysia, for example, who's not an ally, not a treaty partner, the US fleet has returned to ports in Malaysia. Our aircraft have been able to fly through, restock, repair in Malaysia. The Iranian banks that we're trying to open in Malaysia are not opening. Security cooperation, counterterrorism is wonderful. And the Malaysians are a moderate voice in the world of Islam. So there are lots of good security reasons to interact with Malaysia, even if it's not a full-fledged security partner. All right, this has to be the last question. Anybody want to be the one? Way in the back.
Thinking specifically about the tensions around the Senkaku Islands, I wonder if you can comment on the recent agreement over new naval rules and how that may have shifted dynamics.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And you know, on that point, what signs in the next weeks or months would suggest to you that tensions in that area are escalating or that the situation is starting to calm down?
Fine. People may not be aware there's an agreement reached by 21 navies, 21 countries in China at Qingdao in Shandong province just last week on a thing called CUES, Qs. I guess it's Consensus on Unanticipated Encounters at Sea, CUES. And we had been with the Chinese trying since 1998 through our military maritime conversations to reach something like we had with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And that is, China has been without a navy for 600 years. They sank their navy in the early 1400s and didn't really bother to build one until 20 years ago. Now they're building like crazy, and they're showing up all over the world. They've got interests in Africa, Middle East, and they're going to be sending their navies to protect those interests over time. But they don't have an experience. In most services around the world, the Navy is the more sophisticated one because they're always interacting at sea, going to each other's ports. And the Chinese are way behind on this, and they're very suspicious. So we proposed to them in our talks that why don't we do an incidents at sea agreement? So we set up some rules, how many kilometers apart and what kind of operations we refrain from when our ships are near each other. And we had a close call last November when the Chinese were exercising their newly acquired aircraft carrier down off Hainan Island. And they announced a certain area where they were going to exercise. Then they left it and continued exercising. American ship got near, not having been properly notified that there would be, and the Chinese said, well, you got to get out of here, and they tried to shoulder our ship away. And there was no communication going on. There was no mechanism, no set of rules. Finally, luckily, the captain of the aircraft carrier and the captain of the American ship got on the horn to each other and spoke in English and agreed to disentangle themselves. But this created an additional incentive for all of us to find some mechanism. The Chinese are not ready to do an incidents at sea agreement because that had a lot to do with the fact that the Russians could put ships very near our shores and spy on us and do all sorts of things. And we could do that to them. So we agreed to make rules for that. But for China, they don't have ships off our shores yet. They will eventually, but they're not there yet. So they're not interested in cutting a deal that would be inherently unequal at this point. But in a multilateral context, it became much more palatable. And so they've agreed to the CUES in this multilateral context. Subsequently, a Chinese naval admiral announced that they would not necessarily abide by this in all circumstances. And I think he was talking about in Japanese waters, that when they claim that they own those waters and Japan claims they own the waters, they're not going to be able to reach a consensus on how to manage these things. But we're hoping that this CUES agreement becomes a mainstay of how naval operations interact with each other in proximity as that proximity increases. Thanks. Thank you very much, everybody. Nice to have your questions. Thank you.